Welcome back to This Was Supposed to Be Easy, your go-to podcast for connection, joy, and a good dose of laughter.
Hosted by two friends who've seen enough of life to know that it's never as simple as it sounds.
Or looks.
Each conversation celebrates the diverse journeys we travel, the moments of bravery, the strength we didn't know we had, and the joy we find along the way.
Because let's be honest, life is full of things that were supposed to be easy, but turned out to be harder.
And definitely funnier.
Than we thought. This is Amy.
And this is Cheryl. And if it were easy, we wouldn't be here.
One of the things you mentioned a couple of different times were like the pronunciation, things like that, which leads me to question language barriers. You know, for listeners that might be tuning in right now that think, I want to go to these places, how easy was it for someone who doesn't traditionally live there to get around, to understand what was going on, cultural differences? Do you feel like somebody could easily travel over there and understand it with minimal experience?
I think much like many places that you travel, if you're in a bigger city, it might be easier than if you were in a rural area. And so we happen to be in bigger cities. And so, and I will even explicitly say where I was, right? I was in Gothenburg, Sweden. I was in Stockholm, Sweden. I was in Helsinki, Finland. And then I did a day trip to Tallinn, Estonia, which we should talk about in a few minutes, just because it's different, right? It's not part of the Nordic countries or part of Scandinavia either. And so that piece was a little bit different. But I believe because we were in larger cities, we were never anywhere that people didn't speak English. I think in Europe, there are so many different languages. And I'm saying this from someone without, I shouldn't even be allowed to say this because I don't know what I'm saying. But, you know, English sort of has become the language that you can use as you cross borders. So maybe more of the common second language that people can use when they travel to other European countries. And so we always were somewhere where people spoke English. We didn't need translators. And I think the only time I experienced people saying my English isn't good, you know, they were even able to say that and still communicate with me. And that would be when I was in smaller craftsman type shops, you know, like where I was in a store with a woodworker, wood artist who literally was creating things in the back half of the store and selling things in the front half of the store. He clearly didn't have as much English as a lot of the other places. But I would say, number one, in terms of language, it wasn't a problem at all. Even the printed signs had English translations if they didn't, you know, Google on the phone.
I was going to ask that, like, do you have apps and technology? Like, I know there's glasses, there's earpieces now. Obviously, phone apps are probably the most common that you can kind of do some translation. Did anybody that you were traveling with or yourself find any positive experiences with technologies that allowed for maybe an easier language transition?
I think most, maybe all, but I would hate someone to correct me on that. All of us used Google Translate because you can just open up the camera and it will read, you know, it'll translate for you right in the camera. Or you could type something in and it would translate it for you. So I think for the most part, we were perfectly fine using Google Translate. In terms of, we used the public transportation a lot. I think that was helpful because we did have someone who lives in Stockholm, Sweden, along with us on every part of the journey. And so we used it in Gothenburg, where she had visited many times but didn't live, and we did. We got on the tram going in the wrong direction. And so we got on the tram and we started moving, and she's like, I don't think this is right. I don't think this is right. And she did something with her phone to check which direction on the map she was going. She's like, nope, we got to get off and get on the one going in the other direction. But the cool thing was, the ticket wasn't like a one-way kind of ticket. It was like a 70-minute ticket. So you could use the tram for 75 minutes or whatever it was. So we had that experience. We used a train to get from Gothenburg to Stockholm. We pre-bought our tickets ahead of time. So we did that from here in America using the app that she recommended for the train. We did put apps on our phones for the public transit in Stockholm and in Helsinki. All of those things were very doable. I have to tell you, the subway system in Stockholm, I think, was easier than New York City. Like, I did it. I didn't get on the wrong one. You even could, and maybe we can do this in most places here now, but because I don't live in a big city, I don't know. But you could literally just take your phone and have your Apple Pay opened and scan it and, go through the turnstile to get on the subway. And again, it was like a 75-minute pass. And so those pieces of it were very easy. We took a cruise ship, an overnight cruise ship from Stockholm to Helsinki, and that was not only easy, but it was also really fun. So it was as large as when you see like the big, big cruise ships. But the bottom floors of that cruise ship were full of cars and semi trucks and things like that. But, it was fun because there was all the shopping and there were bars and there was a disco and karaoke. And we even saw this late night drag show that was hilarious. So all of those things felt quite easy. Many of the things we did because someone who knew recommended. So I do, say, like, if you know anybody, ask them for their recommendations. If not, use the internet for, top 10 things to do here, or top 10 things to do there. Culturally, I will say this one piece, which is the last place we stayed overnight for 3 nights was Helsinki, which was Finland. And we were forewarned, and we read and saw reels and things like that said, in Finland, people are quieter. They aren't really loud in public. They don't talk really loud at meals. So they don't cut in line. They follow the rules. And so we kept teasing each other leading up to it, like, get ready for Finland because we're pretty loud. When we start laughing at dinner, we're really loud. And absolutely hope that I'm not sounding stereotypical in any way. All I'm doing is sharing my experience. But I do remember we found a restaurant one night in Helsinki, and we thought of it sort of as a fun, probably touristy kind of restaurant because it was called Harold's Viking something, and it had a big ship and all of that's where I, ate one of my reindeer meat dishes. But we realized halfway through dinner that this table of 10 that was sitting like next to us and elevated just a little bit, like, no one talked the whole meal. And like at one point after they left, we said to each other, did you guys realize that no one at that table talked out loud until they were done eating and they were about to leave? Can you imagine sitting with 10 plus people and just eating in silence?
Yeah.
And can you imagine being them and listening to us loud, boisterous, laughing as loud, like we probably should have been a little more aware of ourselves, in that scenario as well. But I did catch myself crossing the street one time, and you're looking at the signals. Is it, the red person that says don't walk or the green person that says you can walk? And there were no cars anywhere to be seen, and it was the red. And I said out loud, because I do this in every city I travel to. I'm like, so is this a city where they cross whenever there's no cars, or is this a city where you do what the light says? And so I said out loud to whoever I was walking with, I said, are they going to follow the signs or are they going to cross because there's no cars? And not thinking there were people standing next to the people I was walking with who were from there. And they literally said, and I'm not going to name the country they referenced, but they said, don't be blank. And it wasn't United States. It was a European country. They said, don't be blank. weight.
Okay.
And I was like, okay, that was the answer to the question I actually verbalized.
Yes. Okay. All right. So makes sense. Rule following is a big thing and doing that. So you mentioned Estonia being a different experience. So as we're kind of talking about what your experiences were like, what made that one different?
Okay. So I will say, so something I learned before I went, we were going to Sweden and Finland as our priority. And I mentioned them as Scandinavian countries. And I was corrected by our partner there. And she's like, they're not Scandinavian countries because Finland is not Scandinavian. So I'm just going to give you a little lesson here, Amy, before we get
Wonderful.
to Estonia. Scandinavia is Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. So even though like the three countries that sort of touch way up here in the north, would be Norway, Sweden, and Finland, Finland's not Scandinavian, it's Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. So the correct word to encompass the two main places that we went would be Nordic countries. So Nordic is a much broader term that includes Denmark and Finland and Norway and Sweden, but also like Iceland and a few other territories. And so I really had to practice saying Nordic instead of Scandinavian. But we did, several of us chose at the end of the trip to do this day trip to Estonia. And number one, if you've never really looked on a map, and I should not acknowledge the fact that I'm a geographer's daughter and I'm saying that, and my brother is like a very well-known like map GIS person. I didn't realize when we were in Helsinki, Finland, how close we were to St. Petersburg, Russia. Very close. So pull up a map sometime, see how close Helsinki is to St. Petersburg, Russia. And while I'm squirreling, little side note about that, Helsinki literally has built an underground city that you can get to, I believe, from their subway system, but also from many other public locations. But underneath the city is a city enough that it includes like theaters and swimming pools and saunas and shopping, but it's big enough to hold the entire population of Helsinki underground. And that is because they're so close to Russia that they needed to have a safe place to go underground in case of whatever
Right.
might come their way. So,
Interesting.
yeah. So anyway, so I sort of say all that as a lead into Estonia because it was a boat ride to Estonia. So another large cruise ship type of boat that again had like semi trucks on it, sort of like we use freighters in the Great Lake to transport materials. They just drive their semi trucks right on. But it was a 2 hour boat ride to Estonia, to Tallinn. So we went early in the morning and then we returned early in the evening. But Estonia was a part of when we were growing up, Amy. I'm a little older than you, I know, but like the former USSR. And so going to Estonia felt, I mean, it was a very big city, but we literally walked as quickly as we could to the ancient Estonia, the old town Estonia. And to give you a picture of it, like if you think about, I don't want to Disneyify it, but if you think of Beauty and the Beast, the Beauty and the movie Beauty and the Beast, it's just like those colorful buildings and very bumpy cobblestone streets and ancient cathedrals, but they're not like the cathedrals I've seen in Italy. They're like the cathedrals I would think of if I'm thinking about Russia. It had just had a very different feel. And I don't know that I even want to say the word Russian sort of feel, but maybe it's just my American idea of that. So going into the gift shops were the big fur hats and the nesting dolls and the wooden eggs that are painted in very reds and blacks and yellows and blues. A lot of wool sweaters and scarves. And again, the wool was also, Finland and Sweden. We're talking about the north, but it just had a very different vibe, a much, very old, very ancient, but also very, I guess, what I've always associated in my head as more Russian art, I guess, or craftsmanship.
Yeah, even looking it up online as you were telling me about Estonia, like all the history goes back to the 11th and 12th centuries.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it does seem like it's a much
Yeah.
older.
I zoomed my camera in on a sign on one of the cathedrals and it said it was 1300 something.
Okay.
Yeah. So old and gorgeous and beautiful. And I didn't go there expecting to buy things because I was like, I'm no longer in the Nordic countries. There were so many different things that I hadn't expected to see that I wanted to bring home to remember that, it was just a really neat day trip kind of experience that had a whole different vibe than what I had experienced in Finland and Sweden. So that was really neat for me I am very happy that it was suggested and that I did it. And at the same time, like, we paid €4 to climb up into the city wall, the ancient city wall around it to see the view, but then up into some of those towers. And I felt like it was in Game of Thrones at that point in time, like it was just so neat to be in a place that was so old, coming from America.
That makes sense. What is your overall take? Like, I mean, I know you do not like doing favorites, so
No
I'm not going to
favorites.
ask you what, was your favorite time, favorite country, anything like that. I'm not going to ask that. But for somebody who's maybe listening to this and thinking about traveling and specifically to these countries, what would you say your biggest takeaway of going somewhere new, learning something that you would absolutely encourage, and maybe what is something that you wish you knew before you went that might help somebody else?
Do your research. So know as well as you're able, know where you're going and ask questions, whether that's of a person that you're connected to or someone who might have traveled there before you or the internet where there are someones who have traveled there before you. Just make sure your answer is coming from people and not AI, right? Because it likes to tell you whatever it thinks you want to hear. But I would say, learn what you can because I was able to appreciate pieces that came from a little bit of pre-knowledge or at least a little bit of pre-questioning. I definitely appreciated the surprises as well. There's things I would have missed. I'm sure there's things I did miss, right? But there's things I would have missed if I hadn't done a little bit of research. What appeals to you? Find out what appeals to you and seek that out. So Suzanne, our friend, was much less familiar with Helsinki, Finland, because she lives in Sweden. And so she had done a pre-trip to Helsinki and literally started just sending me Instagram reels of all things Helsinki. She also did that a little bit for Stockholm and a little bit for Gothenburg, but watching those reels gave us ideas for, oh, we definitely have to do a sauna. And maybe as, a kid, a teenager, a young adult, random saunas in hotels or at a family member's house who had one. I wasn't in love with saunas, but I'm so glad I did it and then dipped at least up to my thighs in the Baltic Sea. The other piece, which I think might be a partial answer to your question, but maybe it's more just because I want to say it. And that is just always being open to the experience and being open to unplanned changes and being adaptable to that, right? So who cares if we got on the wrong tram and went the wrong way and had to get off? That's a funny story later on. Or, yeah, I totally forgot my umbrella. And when it started to pour in Estonia, I got to run into a gift shop and buy a new one or whatever. But very specifically for these countries, I've always been I don't love to be cold, right? I love cozy. There's a reason I'm attracted to the word hygge. But I guess to experience true hygge, you probably need to try going somewhere that's cold that can show you what that is. And so, I read a book recently called How to Winter, and Carrie was her name who wrote the book. She literally went to the northernmost university in the world, I believe. It was in Norway, but she went in the winter. Now, I chose to go in May, but I'm not going to lie, I kind of want to go back in the winter because her experience led her to write this book, How to Winter, from the mindset perspective, right? Like she went to ask people, how do you survive winter? How do you get through it? And their responses to her were, what do you mean get through it? Here's why winter's great. And she didn't expect that. And it just made me want to try that practice, right? To go somewhere that is not only appealing to me for any number of reasons, even my ancestry, but to go there during a time period when I couldn't have fathomed wanting to go there because it's going to be really cold. But I want to go there when it's really cold because I want to experience what a cozy restaurant feels like without all the drafts blowing through because they've structurally planned for that. I want to go there and maybe it's cold, but I get to see the northern lights like I've never been able to experience or, even imagine. And so I guess that's something I want to say about traveling somewhere new is to not only be open to unexpected, be open to shifts, be open to what's new, be open to going at a time frame or time period that you didn't think you would ever want to try. But I'll maybe sort of just end with the words of one of the people that was on the trip with us, because I was leading, but I had never been there myself. And Chris, who said this, also went on a trip with me to Italy, on a trip where we went to a new place in Italy I hadn't been to before. And she just said at one point in the trip, she's like, I just love being with Cheryl when it's Cheryl in a new place. And I was like, wow, that's kind of cool. So I just say that to anybody, like, don't box yourself into, I only love tropical, I only love beaches. Try places that you didn't think you would want to try.
Thanks for tuning in to This Was Supposed to Be Easy. Remember, the best stories are the ones we live.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep the conversation going because life may not be easy, but listening in should be.
Stay curious, stay connected, and keep wondering.